Good afternoon, and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This, and you guessed it, The Appeal. I'm your host for today, Jay Willis. In just over a month, Washington State is poised to join a number of states in going over what experts are calling the eviction cliff. Now, officials have been trying to delay this crisis by passing temporary moratoriums, barring landlords from carrying out evictions during this pandemic. But with the latest moratorium set to expire in March, as many as 150,000 families in Washington State could soon face the prospect of losing their homes. So before we can talk about what can be done about this, let's talk a little about the roots of this problem, which extend back long before anyone had even heard of COVID-19. Housing costs here have skyrocketed in recent years, way faster than wages and income. In Seattle, for example, even before the pandemic began, about half of tenants were already rent burdened, which means that they were paying more than 30% of their income on rent. Now, as is usually the case, all of these hardships have fallen disproportionately on lower income renters and renters of color, who are less likely to have savings built up and who now find themselves bearing the brunt of a pandemic that has eviscerated service sector jobs and other industries that don't easily allow for telework. For the past year, these conditions have prevented a lot of people from keeping up with the rent. And even with eviction suspended, back rent continues to accumulate during that time. Officials think that together, those 150,000 families could have amassed a collective debt of $1 billion. And when March ends, that bill will finally come due. It could subject tens of thousands of renters to an evictions process that has been linked to devastating psychological, social, and economic consequences. It's the kind of crisis that could overwhelm the state's courts, shelters, and streets, all while forcing governments to pick up huge additional costs to fund services for their newly unhoused residents. Now, obviously, there are a lot of important steps that lawmakers would need to take in order to meaningfully address this crisis. But today we're going to talk about just one proposal in particular that would give renters a fighting chance. A new bill introduced in the state legislature could make Washington the first state to require a right to counsel for lower income tenants brought into evictions proceedings. Now, as extended fans of the law and order universe may know, defendants in criminal proceedings have a constitutional right to an attorney. But because evictions take place in the civil legal system, there is no such guarantee. As a result, the vast majority of people facing eviction, as many as 99% in some places, don't have counsel. Landlords, by contrast, have lawyers between 80 and 100% of the time. Now, I'll give you one guess as to how that usually shakes out. Put simply, going through an eviction without an attorney is a losing proposition. Tenants without counsel are more likely to lose their homes, to be forced out in evictions carried out by local sheriff's deputies. They're less likely to be able to negotiate move-out dates, to keep evictions off their records, find rental or relocation assistance, or apply for public housing. Obviously, all of which damages their ability to find housing in the future. These are complicated, fast-moving legal proceedings that aren't familiar or generous to people without legal training, who often find themselves overwhelmed at the speed with which a court decides all their rights, often in just a day. Because people without lawyers tend to fare so poorly in evictions proceedings, many simply can't even participate in the process. In fact, about half of people facing eviction don't even show up to court. So while granting tenants in Washington a right to counsel is not going to solve the housing crisis here, and it might not stop evictions from spiking, it could at least help those families who will still find themselves peering over the edge of that evictions cliff. So for more on this proposal in Washington, I'm joined now by the bill's sponsor, State Senator Patty Kuderer, as well as Edmund Witter, Managing Attorney for the Housing Justice Project of the King County Bar Association. Senator Edmund, thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator, I'll begin with you. What exactly would this bill do? What right would it create? And where does this legislation stand currently?
Well, I'll answer the second part of your question first. The bill was just pulled from rules yesterday, so that means it's headed to the Senate floor for a vote. I do expect that there will be amendments, both those that I want to pass and many that I don't want to have passed. But in terms of what the bill does, is it creates the right to counsel for low-income and indigent tenants. The point, I am a lawyer by trade, so I know the value of legal representation, especially in a situation where you're about to lose your home. I think that that is a very important and pertinent place for us to create a right to counsel. And when you look at the fact that evictions are a leading cause of homelessness, and the number one reason that people face eviction is for non-payment of rent, it makes even more sense to tie it to this situation. So what the bill does, in addition to creating the right to counsel, it makes sure that in the notice, and this is really important because a lot of times tenants don't know their rights, but this is why we have changed the notice that is going out to them to specifically say that they may be entitled to legal representation, and we give them the information of where to call so that they can reach out to folks like your other guest, Edmund Witter, and get advice about how to handle the eviction.
I want to return a little bit later to what you alluded there, some of the amendments that you would not want to pass. But for now, just at a higher level, the evictions moratorium is currently set to expire at the end of March. Are you optimistic that it'll pass in time to help people who might face eviction starting on April 1st?
That's a really good question. I mean, it really depends on how quickly we can get it off the Senate floor and over to the House. And of course, if there are changes made in the House, then that means we have to get together for conciliation and try and figure out what the bill is eventually going to look like. And then we have to concur on those changes. So the answer to your question is no, it may not be done in time for that deadline, to meet that deadline. And if that's the case, what I am, expecting and certainly hoping for is that the governor will simply give us the little additional time that we will need to get this done. This isn't something that we just have been working on in the last month or so. I have been actively engaged in working on this solution since the 2020 session, before that even ended. And that was because we saw what was going to happen. As soon as the pandemic hit and the lockdown happened, and we saw that people were without an income, we knew that they weren't going to be able to pay the rent. So we have been working on this policy for quite some time, and it is a very big policy bill. There's a lot of other things included in there too, like mediation services that are pre-filing of the eviction complaint. So we have a lot of protections built in. We have avenues to create opportunities for the landlord and the tenant to work out the back rent that's due. And the goal is to save as many tenancies as possible, especially now because we're still not out of the pandemic.
Is your office, your caucus, are you working with the governor on this, trying to coordinate the bill's potential passage and also the evictions moratorium expiration?
Yes, we have been actively engaged with the governor's office all along the way. And he had a work group that met over the interim as well, working on this issue. So we have been actively engaged with all of the stakeholders involved in this process. It's a court process, so it necessarily required us to focus on that process in terms of finding a solution to this problem.
Thank you, Senator. Edmund, tell me a little bit about how you view this perspective, working with folks in eviction court. How would this impact your day-to-day work? Why is counsel so important for people who are going to be facing eviction?
Yeah, and thanks for having me on the show. I mean, having counsel is extremely important, I think, as the senator said. I mean, just from a statistical perspective, when we have contact with a household who's facing eviction, we can keep them housed over half the time. And that in and of itself is a reason why we need to give counsel and have that access to that person who can help them navigate the legal system. Because over half the time, just by the mere fact that we have contact with someone, we can keep them housed. But the problem is that 8% of tenants in the state of Washington don't have counsel, period, as you mentioned, I think, earlier. And the fact that most of these cases can be resolved if you just put a little bit of investment and help and gave somebody that opportunity to be able to connect with someone who's going to be able to help them navigate not just the legal system, but also the other social services system, the behavioral healthcare system, the rental assistance that's available, that will make a huge impact. I mean, right now we have hundreds of millions of dollars in the Seattle and King County area that is ready to be administered to households who are about to lose their home because of, failure to pay rent right now that was caused by the pandemic. And a lot of landlords need to have access to that. But you will never have a perfect system where tenants and landlords are going to be able to access that money quickly in an efficient way. What actually, in every single city where you have seen right to counsel happen, it has been successful because an attorney, when they represent a tenant, is not just defending that tenant in court on the legal basis for the eviction, but is also helping that tenant resolve their problem. It is helping that person get the help that they need if they need it. It is also ensuring that ultimately the landlord gets paid. There's a really strong mutual benefit to all this, because the reality is a lot of evictions happen because they're a symptom of poverty. And we allow a lot of people go into our homelessness system just because we do not provide an adequate resource to prevent them, where they are all bottlenecking, which is in the court system and in an eviction process. So it's a critically important thing that I think has been often overlooked in the way we talk about homelessness, and how we don't really stop a lot of people right before they're going to get there. And we really could if we just put the right stop gaps there, and right to counsel is one of those.
One thing we've discussed before is sort of what the outcomes look like with a right to counsel. It's sort of like, you don't really win or lose an election, an eviction. It might not mean staying in your home or not staying in your home. Could you talk about some of the different mediated outcomes that, as a lawyer representing folks in eviction court, you can help them reach, and how that can help tenants going down the road, even if they do end up moving somewhere else?
Yeah, well, 90% of these cases are about rent. So ultimately, a lot of times what it is about getting people help that they need to be able to access that resource. And if you can do that, I mean, the senator actually has worked on bills that are really helpful in this regard in the last couple of years, has really sponsored and pushed this through, so that, when somebody comes in for those 9 out of 10 cases that are just about rent, that somebody's going to be able to have the time to be able to pay back that rent when they owe it. Because most people from our surveys, they fall behind for about a month or less in rent, and because they have experienced temporary unemployment, a medical emergency, or loss in the family. And most people, when they show up to court, have the ability to pay something. They just need a little more time. And so there is that option of just helping somebody navigate that system, and some of the rights that the senator, frankly, has really helped create and made possible in this state, to be able to navigate that system so they get the adequate payment plan, so that they can get the help from a resource, again, the senator's bill has created from prior years, the tenancy preservation program, where somebody can get rental assistance at the time of their court hearing. But the other options that you talked about are also getting that eviction off the record, which can be a permanent stain on somebody trying to get to apply for a new place or to be able to transition in the future. But also sometimes the other outcomes are somebody who needs a behavioral health care assistance, or somebody who needs inpatient care. I just had a client the other day who was experiencing a psychotic break. She was getting evicted. She'd had a perfect tenancy for the last few years, and then suddenly she just started exhibiting very strange behavior. And this person was getting evicted for it. And this person had never had anyone help her access a behavioral health care resource before. And so she would have been just thrown out had we not been there. We helped her get a garden ad litem. We helped her get access to a mental health service to help her kind of just start getting an initial assessment, because she had no resources, no support network here. And she was clearly exhibiting she was decompensating. Something was going on and nobody was catching it. And frankly, we were the ones who caught it right before she would have become homeless, because nobody else was caring about it. Certainly, I don't think, frankly, the landlord cared. But we took that effort and we stepped in and tried to make sure that she get connected. And frankly, she's staying housed and she's getting help, and it's working. And so I think there's a lot of things that are going on that ultimately we can provide help for when you do have that right to counsel. It's not just about providing an attorney. It's about providing a source, a network that is going to help somebody avoid homelessness and ultimately stay safe and healthy.
Thanks. And I do want to welcome King County Councilmember Girmay Zahilay helicoptering in to join us here. And I'm going to kick it right to him. Councilmember, we're talking about the importance here of providing tenants a right to counsel for keeping them in their homes and ensuring that they have access to social services. But I also want to ask you about the intersection between access to housing and racial justice. Why is this a racial justice issue? And what does that look like in Seattle specifically?
In Seattle and King County, we're seeing a displacement crisis, just like many urban areas around the country. Places that were for a long time the homes of Black and brown people are now being gentrified. People are losing their homes rapidly. And many areas of Seattle, we're seeing that happen. And even if you look at our homeless population, Black and Indigenous and Latinx people are overrepresented. And that's because so many of our systems don't work for our Black and brown BIPOC families. So yes, this protecting tenants is a racial justice issue, and I'm thankful for Senator Kuderer and Edmund for all their work as well.
I'm going to come back to you in a little bit, but I want to return to the senator briefly. In news that I'm sure will shock all of you, this is a fairly popular issue with voters. We've got polling conducted by Data for Progress and the Lab, which is a project of the appeal, which shows that voters overwhelmingly want a fairer process for tenants in eviction cases. A little over 2/3 support creating a right to counsel, and that includes a majority of Republicans. This is not a partisan issue. Senator, with that in mind, and again, you alluded to this earlier, I'm curious, what sort of obstacles are there to getting the kind of bill that you want to pass? Who is standing in the way of this? And follow-up question, why?
Good questions. I want to start by first telling you my personal perspective on housing. I view that it's an essential need. I view that housing is a human right because without it, there are so many parts of your life that are impacted. And so for me, it's different. When you are renting an apartment, it's different than if you are renting your car to someone. It's a different concept altogether. So from that standpoint, it's really critical for us to remember that we have to protect that. And in terms of the obstacles, we didn't talk about this part either, but the Landlord-Tenant Act in Washington state was drafted in the late 70s, early 80s by landlord attorneys. So of course it was weighted heavily in favor of a process that benefited landlords. And so when I looked at it initially, I could easily tell that. And as a lawyer, I was reading it, I saw there was criminal nomenclature in the statute, you are guilty of unlawful detainer, things like that were so incendiary and meant to judge people and shame them. And I really found it offensive. And I wanted to balance the scales. And so in terms of the obstacles, well, there's a very strong landlord lobby in the state of Washington. They're very well-funded, and they've been very successful in persuading members on both sides of the aisle in some cases, that we need to take baby steps. But this situation is not amenable to a baby step. We are in a crisis situation. And I was looking to create a permanent structure that not only would address the COVID crisis and the looming evictions from that, but would also withstand the next time we're in this situation, because I can guarantee you there will be a next time. And I think it would be prudent policy, it would be smart for us to take the long view in addition to addressing the emergency situation that we're facing. And so that's really what we're looking at here. And the challenges, honestly, in the legislature are convincing 50% and a little more of your colleagues that this is the right policy for the state of Washington in both chambers.
Councilmember, kind of a similar question. Is creating a right to counsel enough, both in the context of the pandemic and, as the senator mentions, in its aftermath. Like, I'm hearing all this and thinking having a lawyer is great. As Edmund says, he describes all the different ways it can be helpful, but it doesn't mean as much for someone who still ends up getting evicted. And as much as counsel can help, they can't win every single case. People can still end up losing their homes. It's just that they had someone by their side in the process. My question, Councilmember, is what else do you think lawmakers need to do to adequately, sufficiently address this housing crisis that, again, has been brewing for a long time, but has really been exacerbated by the pandemic here?
At the beginning of the pandemic, several of my colleagues and I got together and we drafted a resolution that would ask our state and our federal government to put a pause on rent and mortgage payments during the pandemic. And that's because this pandemic is going to turn from a virus crisis to an eviction crisis very soon, as soon as these moratoriums end. And many people pushed back on this idea of a resolution putting a pause on rent and mortgage payments because they said that how much is this going to cost? How much is it going to cost to put a pause on rent and mortgage payments? But they weren't asking, what is the cost of inaction? The cost of inaction is people losing their homes at an unprecedented rate, our homelessness crisis ballooning out of control, people living on the street, people struggling more than ever, and that cost is incalculable. So I think that during a pandemic, when we are supposed to be staying home, that we need to facilitate people staying home. And we have to take really bold actions in order to really prevent people from being out on the streets at unprecedented rates. So I think that in light of our political environment, in light of legal barriers and lobby barriers, as Senator Kuderer said, a right to counsel is an important first step. But I agree with you, Jay. It's definitely not enough, because once somebody is out on the street, using the court as an enforcement vehicle doesn't help them as much, but it's super necessary, because if we are going to use the court as the enforcement vehicle, a lot of people don't have a right to counsel. A lot of people don't know how to navigate our complex legal systems. So I think it's necessary, but of course not sufficient.
Thank you, Councilmember. Last question. I want to be respectful of folks' time, but I'll turn back to Edmund. We've talked about the acute crisis of right now and the structural failures that have led to this state of widespread vulnerability in the first place. What's the most important thing lawmakers like our guests here and beyond should know? As the senator mentioned, as she's trying to lobby 50% plus one of her colleagues to get behind this, what can elected officials do to help you keep more people safe in their homes? What should they know right now?
Well, I want to echo a lot of what the senator said about housing being a human right. And I think the thing that really needs the perspective that we need to keep in mind here is it doesn't take a lot of people to lose their home through an eviction to ultimately create a crisis. I mean, right now in King County, for example, the number one political issue from polling that I've seen is homelessness and housing right now. And there's only 11,000 homeless individuals in King County, in a county of 2.2 million. That's 0.005%. If you start adding a few thousand of households being evicted through that process, you will exacerbate that crisis. It will become more visible, become more of a problem that everyone's trying to figure out how to solve. And so it doesn't take a lot to sort of push a community onto its brink. And so when you bring in that sort of right to counsel, when you bring out that sort of holistic approach to how do we stop evictions, how do we stop this pipeline into people being homeless, this is a really essential thing that you need to look at. Is it doesn't take a lot of people to lose their homes before you have a crisis. And I think that's the sort of you need to keep that sort of big mentality there. And a lot of these problems are solvable. I think homelessness and evictions is something that we don't have to have. It's not a natural default of any community. It's something that if we use good policy, if we really think about what we're doing and what's causing it, we can stop this, because it's not a universal issue. It's something that's unique to a community because we don't enact the right policies. We don't give the right help to the people in the right places in the right time. And we need to be able to start thinking about it more like that. And so right to counsel it's not always the most obvious thing, but actually it's a way to sort of get, I think, what the council member was saying, which is let's get out of this framework of looking at evictions as being this severe legal problem and the court as being the enforcement mechanism. But actually what Right to Counsel does is it actually kind of gets you to start thinking about this problem more holistically and start approaching it based on all the other social issues that are rising out of it. And so Right to Counsel is just a step in that direction. You still need the rent assistance. You still need the other help. You still need to really examine more deeply about why is it that we rush people out the door or throw them out pretty quickly in a state when we don't do that with foreclosures in the same way. But I still think that there's a bigger question here, but at the least, this is a big step in the right direction. And both the councilman and the senator for their leadership on it.
Senator Patty Kuderer, Councilmember Girmay, Zahilay, and Edmund Witter, thanks so much for taking the time again to talk about this morning. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, again, in a little more than a month, the evictions moratorium in Washington is set to expire. At that point, tens of thousands of families across the state will be at risk of losing their homes. Now, it's hard to overstate the potential magnitude of this crisis. Shelters are already strained, and putting so many people out of their homes at once could also exacerbate the dangers of crowded congregate settings during the pandemic. Now, one thing lawmakers could do, and perhaps the least we can do, is pass legislation guaranteeing the right to counsel for lower income tenants facing eviction. As we've talked about, this obviously isn't sufficient to stop the crisis, but it could dampen the blow significantly, ensuring that people have proper representation to get a fighting chance to stay in their homes and to access so many other critical social services that are often beyond the scope of what people without representation can reach. Now, one other important thing is it's important to understand that the financial or fiscal case for a right to counsel is really as strong as the moral and humanitarian one. Studies have repeatedly shown that funding representation for tenants in the evictions process is less expensive than the costs associated with caring for people who lose their homes because they don't have a lawyer. Now, of course, no fundamental right should be contingent on the satisfactory results of a cost-benefit analysis. But for politicians who are nervous about, responsible stewardship of public resources, especially now at a moment when state and municipal budgets are tightening, one thing we know is that having the foresight to spend this money is a choice that can literally pay for itself. That's all the time we have today on The Appeal Live. Thank you so much for watching. If you don't already, please subscribe to Appeal News on Facebook and The Appeal on Twitter for more news, shows, and updates just like this one. For The Appeal Live, I'm Jay Willis. Have a good weekend.